The Gospel of Mark is the first out of the four canonical Gospels that you'll find in the New Testament. It was written during a time of intense conflict between Jewish freedom fighters and the Roman Empire, which resulted in the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple. The Gospel of Mark reflects on these events as it tells its own story of the good news of Jesus. Contrary to the popular belief among Christians, the Gospels were not written with the intent of being taken literally or historically. The authors of the four Gospels aren't quite four witnesses telling the same story. Instead, they're four distinct men with different interpretations of the Christian message. For example, the author of the Gospel of John views Jesus as God incarnate, and so he portrays Jesus as such in his Gospel. There are also many things that affect how the author wrote their own respective gospel, the sources they use for their stories about Jesus and his sayings, and most importantly, its own proper socio-cultural context. The Gospel of Mark is said to have been written and composed around the year 70 CE, around the time the Temple of Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans. It truly was a devastating point in history for the Jews, and like the Israelites after the destruction of the first temple in 586, the Jews questioned why would God allow such a thing to happen. The Gospel of Mark reflects on these events, and today we'll be examining the Gospel of Mark not from a Christian theological perspective, but from its proper historical context to know what the author and its community believed. This isn't to take away from any theological conclusions people may have of it though. The Gospel of Mark is widely agreed upon by critical biblical scholars as the earliest of the four Gospels. This is made clear when compared to the other Gospels that share similar stories such as Matthew and Luke. Oftentimes, if you compare Mark with either Matthew or Luke, you'll find stories in Mark that Matthew or Luke will expand upon or change, but never the other way around. For example, there's the story of Jesus walking on water that you'll find in Mark 6 and Matthew 14. In Mark 6, Jesus walks on water and his disciples are terrified, to which Jesus says, "It is I," and they let him into the boat. In Matthew, however, Peter asks Jesus if he too could walk on water, but Peter becomes frightened and nearly drowns, to which Jesus asks, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" This may seem minor, but is pretty significant as the two authors essentially have two interpretations of the story. Mark's version, however, is more primitive than Matthew's. Never do you see it the other way around. Another example is the Olivet Discourse, which happens in Mark 13, Matthew 24 through 25, and Luke 21. In all three Gospels, Jesus does predict the destruction of the temple, but what's different comes next. In Mark 13, Jesus warns his disciples of the abomination of desolation that's mentioned in the book of Daniel. Now, if you don't know, during the time of the book of Daniel was written, the author anticipated that the end was to come when Antiochus IV, infamous among the Jews, was to offer a pig on the altar, something that would anger God so much it would essentially force his hand to bring his kingdom on earth. The author of Mark would take this to mean something that was relevant to his time, and during his time, there was a war between the Romans and the Jews, and he likely anticipated that Jesus was to come back when this abomination will happen, whatever it was. Neither happened, of course, and so the authors of Matthew and Luke, who were writing decades later, reinterpreted these words. Luke, in fact, doesn't even mention the abomination anymore, instead changing it to say, "When you see Jerusalem surrounded by its armies, you know its desolation is near." That is different from Mark 13 and Daniel's abomination that causes desolation. Matthew and Luke would expand upon a single chapter from Mark 13, and would add parables and signs of the coming of the Son of Man. Mark 13:24 says that in those days after that suffering, the sun will be darkened, etc., etc. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. Matthew, though, copies this by saying immediately after the suffering of those days, while in Luke, he removes this phrase that speaks of immediacy because obviously Jesus didn't come after Jerusalem was destroyed, the author knows this. Luke instead speaks of the signs in the sun, the moon, and the stars, and all kinds of bad things, then the Son of Man will come. Luke doesn't specify when these bad things will occur. One more thing about the composition of Mark. Just from reading Mark, we can tell it was translated from Aramaic. The Gospels were all written in Greek. How good is the Greek varies, but for Mark specifically, we know that some of his stories were translated from Aramaic, which means Mark used some sort of Aramaic source for some of the sayings and stories about Jesus. An example of this is in Mark 5:41, the story of the raising of Jairus' daughter. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, Talitha cum, which means, little girl, get up. Another example is one you all know, Mark 15:34, and at the 9th hour Jesus shouted in a loud voice, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? Another example is in Mark 7:34, then looking up to heaven he sighed and said to him, I don't know how to say that, but it means be opened. Mark has to explain some of these Aramaic phrases to his Greek-speaking audience. I'm not necessarily saying there's an earlier yet to be discovered gospel that's written in Aramaic, therefore making Mark somehow more historical. These sources could have been oral sources or a collection of sayings and stories about Jesus. The Gospel of Mark tries to make sense of the suffering the people of his time are facing and have faced at the hands of the Romans and the war. The Gospel of Mark wrestles with theological questions related to suffering, the suffering of the people during and after the war, as well as the suffering of the Messiah, which is something no one would expect during that time. This is why in Mark 8, when the Gospel begins to take a more serious turn, Jesus reveals his coming death at the hands of his political enemies, but that after his death he'll be raised again. Jesus follows this up by talking about how suffering is a necessary evil in this world before tasting glory. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Mark 8:36. The next chapter, Mark 9, has the disciples questioning Jesus why he must face suffering, to which Jesus replies that Elijah is coming to restore all things, then goes on to say that Elijah has come and they did to him as he pleased. I'm not exactly sure what this means. I think Jesus, in Mark anyways, believes John the Baptist is the coming of Elijah, since the Baptist faced suffering and execution, and that's kind of what's being said here. The prophet suffered and so must I, essentially. Going back to Mark 8, this is also the first time Jesus reveals to his disciples in words that he is the Messiah, something the readers already know since the very first chapter and verse. In the previous chapters, we've seen Jesus work his miracles of healing and casting out demons, yet all those times he tells the people to keep quiet and tell no one. Why is this? Well, I don't know actually. There is a theory that the reason why the author of Mark has this messianic secret is to explain why is it that the people of Jesus' time did not believe Jesus to be the Messiah. I mean, that's a valid question. If Jesus is the Messiah, how come the people of his time rejected him? But there's one small problem with this theory. The people didn't really listen. A common theme in Mark is that Jesus is misunderstood, either by his disciples, his own family, and his own people. No one seems to get it. And this is shown again in Mark 8 when Jesus asks his own disciples, who do the people think he is? They give varying answers. Mark 8 also challenges the conventional idea of the Messiah of the time, as after Jesus revealed to his disciples that he is the one, he tells them to shut up about it, then goes on to say that the Messiah must suffer and die, which Peter contests. The only ones to recognize Jesus as the Messiah are demons and the centurion by the cross. Jesus' enemies, essentially, are the only ones to recognize Jesus' messiahship. When Jesus reveals he's the Messiah, the author makes a note that Jesus said this all openly, yet no one gets him. Nobody in the gospel understands Jesus, his nature, and his predestined fate at the hands of his enemies. This trend of Jesus being misunderstood or disobeyed continues all the way to the ending when the women who visit the tomb find a young man who I assume is meant to be an angel. So much for those so-called biblically accurate angels. The boy tells them to meet Jesus in Galilee as he is risen, but of course the women get frightened and tell no one. Most people were, of course, uncontent with this ending, and some scribes later added an intermediate and longer ending, though most critical scholars believe the author intended to end the Gospel in 16:8, and I think so too. A personal view of mine is that Mark ends at 16:8 without Jesus appearing on screen, so to speak, is because Jesus was not present during the events of the war. Jesus didn't descend from the heavens to defeat Vespasian and the Romans. This, of course, doesn't mean that Jesus didn't rise from death in Mark's narrative, only that the author didn't have Jesus show up for the final scene. The absence of Jesus at the resurrection part is another reason why Mark seems like the first gospel, as later authors of Matthew and Luke who saw Mark and were uncontent as we are, added their own endings or resurrection narratives. Now, I'd like to say that just because you know the historical reading of Mark does not mean you can't have your own theological views about it. Theological readings are, in my atheistic opinion, look, I just made up a word there, are completely valid so long as one acknowledges the historical truth behind the text. One's faith and values may be important, but the history behind it and the original intentions behind the text are important as well. I'd like to add that the historical reading of Mark isn't the quote-unquote correct or true reading, it's a reading of the text. History and theology are different and separate, but one can believe in both, or at least understand both. One might have different reasons for reading Mark theologically, and that's perfectly fine. I just don't like this idea people have that the Gospels are four witnesses in court telling the same thing, or that the Gospels are meant to be history. Because they aren't. They have their own theological beliefs about Jesus, about suffering, and the subject matters they tackle in their writings. Think of the Gospels as, let's say, social commentary for their time instead of pure biographies. If you smash together all four Gospels, you miss the point each one tries to make. This is the case, for example, with the 7 last words. Each phrase that's exclusive to their own Gospel shows us a different character of Jesus, and so jumbling them together, well, you lose that Jesus and his character. Do you have a Jesus who's frozen and quiet amidst his suffering, questioning God why he has to suffer? Or do you have the Jesus who's in control and keeps talking even as he's dying? But those are my closing thoughts. I think one can be a pious Christian while knowing the historical facts. Christianity is, after all, a religion, and most of religion is personal interpretation and spirituality. It doesn't matter that the Gospels aren't historical, but it's the message one takes from it that matters. Personally, I'm not interested in that. That's why I covered the historical reading of Mark. Matthew's up next, then Luke acts.
Oh, potatoes and molasses. If you want some, oh, just ask us. They're warm and soft like puppies in socks.